We all love to think we're the captains of our own ship, right? That every choice we make is, well, ours. But what if I told you that countless choices you make every single day are being guided by hidden psychological forces you don't even notice? So, are you really in control? Let's pull back the curtain and see what's really going on.
To get us started, let me ask you something kind of weird. Why is margarine yellow? Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's just its color. But the real story is so much more interesting, and it reveals a powerful secret about how our minds actually work. So, back in the 1940s, a psychologist named Louis Cheskin ran this brilliantly sneaky experiment. He served one group of housewives what they thought was butter, but it was actually yellow margarine. Then, for another group, he did the exact opposite. He served them what they thought was margarine, which in reality was just butter with the color taken out. And you are not going to believe what happened. They complained the margarine tasted oily and cheap, when they were actually complaining about the butter. Cheskin's little trick proved that what we expect to taste powerfully shapes what we actually taste. He gave this a name: sensation transference. It means our feelings about the color, the packaging, the whole presentation, all of that gets transferred directly onto the product itself. I mean, think about it. Does a fancy label on a bottle of wine actually make it taste better? According to this principle, you bet it can. And yep, that's why margarine has been yellow ever since. Okay, so with that in mind, let's switch gears and look at one of the most powerful tools of influence there is: making things incredibly easy. And I want you to think of it less like pushing the accelerator on someone's motivation and more like just releasing the handbrake. The brilliant Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman just nails it with this quote. He says, instead of asking, how can I get them to do it, ask, why aren't they doing it already? You see the shift there? The best way to change behavior isn't always to pile on more motivation. Often, it's about finding and removing all those tiny points of friction, the little hindering forces that are stopping people in their tracks. And this is where it gets absolutely wild. Just look at this chart from a study on an educational service. When parents had to fill out a normal form, you see that tiny little bar on the left? A measly 1% signed up. Just by simplifying it to a text reply, it jumped to 8%. But the real game changer? Auto-enrollment. All parents had to do was reply stop if they wanted to opt out. And the result? A staggering 97% stayed in the program. And if you want a perfect real-world example of this, look no further than this restaurant in London. They wanted to sell more champagne, but instead of running a bunch of promotions, they just removed that tiny bit of friction of having to flag down a waiter. They installed this button at every single table. The result? They now sell more champagne than any other restaurant in all of Britain. That's the power of easy. Okay, so making things easy is basically a superpower. Simple enough, but, and this is a big but, if ease is so effective, why in the world would you ever want to make things more difficult for people? Well, let's look at two totally fascinating and kind of mind-bending techniques that seem to be complete opposites. On one side, you've got the foot in the door technique. You start with a tiny, easy to say yes to request. Once they've agreed, they're way more likely to agree to your real, bigger requests later. But then there's the door in the face technique. Here, you do the exact opposite. You start with a massive, unreasonable request you know they'll say no to. Then, when you follow up with your actual, smaller request, it suddenly seems way more reasonable. But there's an even bigger reason to add a little difficulty, and it has the perfect name: the IKEA effect. I mean, come on, have you ever felt that weird sense of pride after struggling for hours to build a flat-pack bookcase? That's the idea right here. The effort we put into something makes us value it, and yeah, even love it a whole lot more. And this isn't just a feeling. The data is just, wow. In the original study, people who actually built a simple IKEA box were willing to pay a massive 63% more for it than people who were just handed a pre-built one. Our own effort literally creates value in our minds. It's wild. So how do we square this circle? When is easy good and when is difficult better? Well, the key isn't really about physical difficulty, like wrestling with an Allen key. It's about a different kind of effort altogether, a little bit of mental heavy lifting. Take a look at this headline from a real ad campaign. I'll give you a second.
Your brain filled in those blanks almost instantly, didn't it? Obesity. That tiny moment of mental work you just did has a surprisingly powerful effect. This is something called the generation effect. And studies have shown that when we have to actively generate an answer ourselves, even if it's just filling in a letter, we're about 15% more likely to remember that information later on. It's exactly why flashcards where you have to recall the answer work so much better than just rereading your notes over and over.
Okay, so making our brains work a little helps things stick. But what about making things easier for our brains? Well, that leads us to another incredibly powerful mental shortcut, sometimes called the Keats heuristic, or my favorite, the rhyme as reason effect.
In this really clever study, researchers took a bunch of proverbs and created two different versions. In the left column, you have the original rhyming version, like woes unite foes. And in the right column, you have a version that means the exact same thing but doesn't rhyme. Woes unite enemies. Then they just asked people how accurate these statements felt. And here's the crazy part. The rhyming proverbs were rated as 17% more believable. Think about that for a second. The only thing that changed was the rhyme. Our brain just hears that smooth poetic fluency and thinks, that sounds right. It must be true. And if you think this is just some little lab trick, think again. This was probably one of the most famous lines from one of the biggest trials of the last century. Would, if the gloves don't fit, you must find him not guilty, have been nearly as powerful? No way. That rhyme made it memorable, it made it persuasive, and it made it feel like an undeniable truth. So let's pull it all together now. We started with sensation transference, how the look and feel of something can literally change how we experience it. Then we dove into that battle between making things totally frictionless and adding just enough effort to make us value them more. And finally, we saw how our brains take these little shortcuts, using puzzles to remember things and rhymes to believe them. When you start to combine all of these forces, you really do start to see the hidden architecture of choice all around you. So, what's the big picture here? Well, first off, remember that what you see and feel about the packaging actually changes the product itself. Second, the easiest path is almost always the one most traveled, so if you want to drive action, remove the friction. But third, don't forget that a little bit of the right kind of effort, that IKEA effect, can make people absolutely love what they've created. And finally, if you engage the brain with small puzzles and catchy rhymes, you can make your ideas not just more memorable, but a whole lot more persuasive. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought. Now that you know the playbook, now that you can see the strings, what little hidden persuaders, what illusions of choice are you going to spot out in the wild today?